Case File 709. The monitor showed a straight line, a perfect horizontal trace across the grid. To the Admiral standing at the bedside, rigid in his dress uniform, that line meant the end of a dynasty. To the Chief of Neurology, sweating in his lab coat, it meant a clinical consensus had finally been reached. But to anyone who actually understood the language of voltage, that silence was impossibly loud. The machine wasn't reading death, it was reading a lie. The failure wasn't in the boy's brainstem, it was in the physics of the room itself. The silence on the screen was actually a deafening noise that the doctors were too afraid to hear. The corruption of the data began 48 hours earlier, the moment the transport helicopter touched down on the roof. In any standard trauma case, the patient is a set of variables: blood pressure, intracranial pressure, oxygen saturation. The identity is irrelevant until the patient is stable. But when the patient is the 20-year-old son of a Four-Star Admiral, the variables are rewritten by rank. The hospital stopped functioning as a medical instrument and started operating as a theater of command. We call this VIP syndrome, and in the world of forensic telemetry, it is a known distortion field. It bends the light, and it bends the data. The boy had suffered blunt force trauma during a training accident, a deceleration injury that turned the brain into a projectile inside the skull. The protocol for this is rigid: immediate neuromonitoring, aggressive management of swelling, and a sterile environment free of external variables. But the Admiral didn't just bring his son, he brought his command structure. The trauma bay, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, was cleared. The residents were pushed out. The Chief of Neurology was summoned from home, bypassing the attending physicians who actually knew how to run the machines. This was the first technical error: the removal of the experts who understood the baseline. The chief hadn't calibrated a bedside EEG in 10 years, but his status demanded he hold the leads. Triage protocols were discarded for executive care, moving the patient to the top floor VIP suite, a room designed for dignitaries, with plush carpets, heavy drapes, and a different electrical grid than the ICU. The setup of the room was a forensic nightmare. The Admiral's security detail insisted on establishing a secure perimeter. They brought in portable encryption arrays, heavy military-grade communication jamming equipment, and satellite uplinks. The hospital facilities team, intimidated by the uniforms and the shouting, allowed the security team to plug their high-load racks into the red outlets. In a hospital, the red outlets are sacred. They are the emergency power circuits, backed up by generators and isolated from the building's dirty power to ensure life support never fluctuates. By plugging a military comms array into that circuit, they didn't just draw power. They introduced a foreign electrical signature into the very veins of the room. For 48 hours, the distortion compounded. The medical team was so focused on the Admiral's stoic grief that they stopped looking at the raw telemetry. They saw what they expected to see: a tragic, linear decline. When the intracranial pressure monitors showed erratic spikes, they attributed it to the injury, not to the fact that the sensors were fighting for bandwidth against a jamming signal. When the heart rate monitor showed a weird, rhythmic flutter, they treated it as cardiac stress, not realizing it was synchronized perfectly with the encryption refresh rate of the communication rack in the corner. The status bias was absolute. No one wanted to be the one to tell the Admiral his equipment was hurting his son. So they didn't. They let the environment degrade the data until the data confirmed their worst fears. The boy's brain function appeared to cease. The swelling, according to the distorted sensors, had crushed the brainstem. The flatline appeared on the EEG, a clean, unmoving cursor tracing the absence of life. The Chief of Neurology didn't look for the noise floor. He simply uncapped his pen. With the Admiral watching, stone-faced and broken, the chief signed the declaration of brain death. The time of death was recorded based on a signal that wasn't there. The file was closed, the organ donation team was alerted, and the boy was legally dead. The medical team, exhausted and subconsciously looking for permission to stop fighting, moved to the final verification, the apnea test. It is a brutal piece of clinical theater, designed to prove the absence of the most primitive drive in the human body: They disconnected the ventilator. The room went silent, save for the hum of the Admiral's security rack in the corner. The doctors watched the boy's chest, looking for the slightest heave, the desperate autonomic attempt of the brainstem to scrub carbon dioxide from the blood. The CO2 levels climbed, turning the blood acidic, a chemical scream that should have triggered a gasp. But the chest remained still. To the Admiral, this was the final proof that his son was gone. To the doctors, it was the physiological stamp on the death certificate. They saw a brain that wouldn't command the lungs. They didn't consider that the command might be getting lost in the static. With the diagnosis secured, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from preservation to logistics. The Admiral, a man whose entire existence was defined by service and utility, needed to extract meaning from the loss. He couldn't save the boy, so he would deploy the assets. The conversation turned to organ donation with jarring speed. The Admiral wanted the death to count. He spoke of legacy and duty, framing the harvesting of his son's organs as a final mission. This introduced a new, dangerous variable: time pressure. Organ viability is a decaying function. The moment brain death is declared, the clock starts ticking on the kidneys, the liver, the heart. The procurement team was summoned. They are the closers of the medical world, efficient and focused. They didn't look at the EEG monitor to analyze the wave. They looked at it to confirm the timeline. The rush to honor the Admiral's wishes bypassed the standard cooling-off period. The file was being stamped and processed before the machines were even powered down. The emotional weight of the Admiral's grief acted as a blinder, narrowing the vision of every clinician in the suite. They were so focused on the tragedy, they missed the anomaly. The chief signed the time of death, 9:42. The Admiral nodded, a sharp, military acceptance of the casualty. The residents cleared the room to allow the family a final moment. The data, that impossible, perfect, artificial line, was saved to the patient's permanent record. It was packetized, encrypted, and sent down the fiber optic lines, away from the plush silence of the VIP suite, down through the riser shafts, and into the cold, concrete belly of the hospital archives. The patient was still warm, but his file was now a closed case, a static object moving toward the basement, waiting for a technician who didn't care about the rank, only the resistance. 5 floors below the VIP suite, in a windowless room that smelled of ozone and stale coffee, Arthur Penhaligon opened the file. Penhaligon did not wear a lab coat. He wore a gray technician's cardigan and corrective lenses thick enough to distort the size of his eyes. He was not a doctor. He was the Signal Auditor, a title that appeared nowhere on the hospital's donor wall, but appeared on every liability insurance form the legal department filed. To the clinical staff, Penhaligon was a ghost, a relic of the engineering department who occasionally surfaced to tag a broken ventilator. In reality, he was the hospital's black box recorder. He didn't treat patients. He treated the data they left behind. The Admiral's son was case file 709 to Penhaligon. The file arrived in his queue not as a tragedy, but as a Priority 1 liability review. His job was routine but critical. Scrub the device logs for anomalies, verify that every alarm had sounded when it was supposed to, and confirm that the equipment had not contributed to the patient's death. It was a forensic cleaning service for the hospital's conscience. He opened the raw telemetry feed, expecting the standard chaotic decline of a trauma case. Instead, he saw the straight line. He leaned in, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off his glasses. Most people look at a flat line and see the end of a life. Penhaligon looked at it and saw a signal processing problem. He bypassed the clinical viewer, the pretty interface designed for doctors who needed simple answers, and opened the raw hex data. He wasn't looking for brainwaves anymore. He was looking for the noise floor. In every electrical system in North America, there is a ghost in the machine, the 60 Hz mains hum. It is the electromagnetic heartbeat of the power grid, a constant low-frequency buzz that radiates from every wall outlet, every light fixture, and every power cord. Sensitive medical equipment is designed to filter this out, to scrub the alternating current from the biological signal. But the hum is always there, buried in the background static, a microscopic vibration that proves the machine is plugged in and the world is turning. Penhaligon zoomed the spectral display to the microvolt level. He was looking for that 60 Hz fingerprint, the subtle ripple that should exist at the bottom of the graph. If the patient was truly dead, the line should be a gentle, random wander of thermal noise, with that faint 60 Hz ripple riding underneath. But what he saw made him stop chewing his pen. The line was absolute. It was mathematically flat. It was pinned to the zero axis with a rigidity that didn't exist in nature. He checked the gain settings on the log. They were set to maximum sensitivity. If the gain was maxed, the background noise should be a roaring blizzard of static. Instead, there was nothing. Penhaligon frowned and typed a command to check the rail voltage. In signal processing, the rail is the limit of the amplifier's power. If you scream into a microphone that can't handle the volume, the sound doesn't get louder, it cuts out. The wave hits the ceiling and flattens. It's called clipping. He cross-referenced the timestamp. The EEG log showed a drift of 400 milliseconds against the heart rate monitor. The internal clock of the neuromonitor was lagging. Digital clocks don't lag unless the processor is under extreme load. The machine was working harder to record nothing than it usually worked to record a seizure. "You're not empty," Penhaligon whispered to the screen, his voice dry and devoid of sentiment. "You're full." The realization hit him with the cold logic of an engineer. The flatline wasn't an absence of activity. It was a signal so powerful, so overwhelming, that it had saturated the input buffers of the EEG. The machine was deafened. It was like trying to hear a whisper while standing next to a jet engine. The microphone wasn't recording silence. It was recording the maximum capacity of its own sensors. The death on the screen was actually a clipping error. The boy's brain might be silent, or it might be active, but no one could tell because the room itself was saturating the sensors. He looked at the time. The organ procurement team was scheduled to begin the harvest in 45 minutes. Once they clamped the aorta, the clipping error wouldn't matter anymore. The biology would catch up to the lie on the screen. Penhaligon pushed his chair back. The wheels squeaked on the linoleum, a sharp sound in the quiet basement. He wasn't a doctor. He had no authority to stop a clinical procedure. He was a mechanic. But he knew that you don't scrap a car just because the speedometer is broken. He grabbed his tool bag, a battered canvas sack filled with fluke meters, spectrum analyzers, and crimping tools. He didn't call the Chief of Neurology. He didn't page the attending. He knew the hierarchy. They would argue with him. They would talk about clinical signs and apnea tests. They would use rank to bury the physics. He needed to prove it. He needed to see the room. He needed to find the source of the noise that was loud enough to mask a life. Penhaligon badged out of the archives and headed for the elevator, rising from the dead silence of the basement toward the high-voltage noise of the VIP suite. The elevator doors slid open on the 12th floor, revealing an atmosphere that was pressurized, distinct from the chemical antiseptic smell of the lower wards. The VIP wing smelled of fresh lilies and filtered air. It was quiet, but it was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a submarine before a depth charge. Arthur Penhaligon pushed his service cart, a rolling metal tray rattling with the mundane tools of the trade, down the hallway. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like exactly what his badge claimed he was: biomedical support services. In the hierarchy of the hospital, he was invisible, a blue-collar mechanic moving through a white-collar tragedy. He reached the door of the suite. A Marine in dress blues stood guard, his eyes tracking the service cart with practiced suspicion. Penhaligon didn't make eye contact. He simply pointed to the sticker on his chest and muttered, "Equipment check, liability protocol." The Marine nodded, stepping aside not out of respect, but out of indifference. To the security detail, Penhaligon was just part of the building's plumbing, as essential and ignorable as a thermostat. Penhaligon entered the suite. The room was dim, lit only by the amber glow of the monitoring arrays and the harsh blue standby lights of the life support systems. The air was warm, too warm for a trauma case, heated by the bodies of the gathered family and the thermal exhaust of too much electronics. The Admiral sat in a high-backed chair near the window, a silhouette of rigid grief, staring at the city lights below. The medical staff huddled in the corner, speaking in hushed tones, already using the past tense. Penhaligon didn't look at the boy. The patient was a biological fact. The problem was likely electrical. He moved to the head of the bed, his eyes scanning the room not for symptoms, but for blast geometry. He was looking for the layout of the copper, the invisible web of power distribution that underpinned the entire suite. In forensic engineering, the layout tells the story. You look for the tension in the cables, the angles of the connections, the proximity of the high-voltage lines to the low-voltage sensors. His eyes landed on the corner of the room, behind the ventilator. It was a mess of cabling, a snake pit that would have failed any standard safety audit. But it wasn't the tangle that made Penhaligon stop. It was the color of the outlet. The hospital wall featured a row of standard ivory outlets and a single, bright red outlet. In medical construction, the red outlet is sacred. It designates the emergency power circuit, a clean, isolated line fed by a backup generator and filtered through a massive isolation transformer. It is designed to provide technical power, electricity so clean and stable that it has zero fluctuation. It is reserved exclusively for life support equipment, the ventilator, the infusion pumps, the EEG monitor. But the ventilator wasn't the only thing plugged into the red outlet. Jammed into the second socket of the red duplex was a heavy black power cable, thick as a thumb, winding its way to a portable rack case sitting on the floor. Penhaligon recognized the device immediately. It wasn't medical. It was a tactical communications array, a military-grade encryption hub used to secure satellite lines. The Admiral's security team, needing a reliable power source for their command post, had plugged their high-load switching power supply hardware directly into the clean medical ground. Penhaligon felt a cold spike of realization. They had created a, quote, ground loop. By plugging the military array into the reference ground, they weren't just drawing power, they were dumping high-frequency encryption noise directly into the grounding pin. The EEG leads, designed to drain interference to ground, were now acting as antennas, injecting that noise straight into the monitor. The, quote, flatline wasn't death, it was signal saturation. The monitor was trying to read a signal millions of times louder than a brainwave, and had clamped the needle to the center to protect itself. Penhaligon stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to stop the harvest. He turned to the attending nurse, his invisibility suddenly a liability he had to shed. Penhaligon cleared his throat. It was a small, mechanical sound, but in the acoustic vacuum of the VIP suite, it sounded like a breaker tripping. The attending nurse turned, her expression shifting from professional empathy to administrative annoyance. She was guarding the perimeter of a tragedy, protecting the Admiral's grief from the mundane interruptions of the hospital's lower functions. To her, Penhaligon was just a man in a gray cardigan holding a multimeter, a member of the facilities staff who had picked the worst possible moment to check a wall socket. She moved to intercept him before he could reach the bedside, her body language forming a physical barrier between the technician and the family. He kept his voice low, trying to pitch it below the ambient noise of the room. He pointed to the red outlet, then to the black cable snaking across the floor. He didn't use the word mistake. He didn't accuse the Admiral's security team of negligence. He spoke the language of the building code. He explained that the equipotential bonding of the room had been compromised. He explained that the reference grounding point was currently carrying a high-frequency voltage that mimicked the silence of brain death. He tried to tell her that the boy wasn't flatlining. He was being drowned out. The nurse shook her head, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through his technical explanation. She told him that the time of death had been certified. She told him the family was saying their goodbyes. She told him that now was not the time to worry about wiring issues or voltage leaks. In her eyes, the medical event was over. The only remaining protocol was the social management of the loss. She looked at Penhaligon's badge, biomedical support, and then back at his face. The dismissal was absolute. He was a mechanic. He fixed broken pumps and loose rails. He did not diagnose neurological activity. This is the authority gradient in its most lethal form. In the aviation industry, pilots are trained to flatten the gradient, to encourage co-pilots to speak up when the captain makes an error. But in medicine, the gradient is a cliff. The Chief of Neurology is at the summit, holding the accumulated weight of decades of specialized education and social status. The biomedical technician is at the base, holding a screwdriver. Information flows down that cliff easily, but it cannot climb up. For a technician to correct a chief on a diagnosis is not just a breach of etiquette, it is seen as an intellectual impossibility. The system assumes that the person with the highest rank has the highest resolution view of the truth. Penhaligon realized that he couldn't win this argument with words. The nurse wasn't listening to the physics, she was listening to the hierarchy. She ordered him to leave the suite, to file his maintenance ticket, and to come back when the room was empty. She turned her back on him, returning to the Admiral's side, effectively sealing the boy's fate with a wall of white linen. Penhaligon stood there for a second, the spectrum analyzer in his hand vibrating slightly, sensing the invisible energy in the room that no one else believed in. He retreated to the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the noise inside and leaving him in the sterile silence of the corridor. He looked down at his tablet. The ticket for Room 1204, Telemetry Audit, was still open. The protocol was simple. Log the finding, note the interference as a quality control issue, and close the ticket. If he walked away now, he would be safe. He would keep his pension. He would remain the invisible man who kept the lights on. The boy would die. The organs would be harvested, and the Admiral would bury a hero. The hospital would avoid a scandal. The paperwork would be clean. But Penhaligon was an engineer. To an engineer, a false signal is an insult to the universe. He looked at the time. The organ procurement team was scheduled to arrive in less than an hour. Once they rolled the patient into the operating theater, they would clamp the aorta. The clipping error would become a biological reality. The boy would be killed by a loop of copper wire and a misunderstanding of Ohm's law. Penhaligon felt the weight of the tablet in his hand. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't a hero. But he knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who trusts math more than people, that the machine was lying. He couldn't file the report. He had to break the circuit. Penhaligon didn't knock. He didn't ask for permission. In the hierarchy of the hospital, asking implies uncertainty, and Penhaligon was no longer uncertain. He kicked the doorstop into place and rolled the heavy cart back into the VIP suite, the wheels thumping over the threshold with a sound that broke the somber rhythm of the vigil. He held a Fluke 435 power quality analyzer in his right hand, the heavy rubberized case looking less like a medical instrument and more like a weapon. The screen was already glowing, painting his face in a harsh, industrial orange. The attending nurse moved to intercept him, her face flushing with the anger of a protector whose sanctuary has been breached. She opened her mouth to order him out, to call security, to invoke the sanctity of the dying. Penhaligon didn't let her speak. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the space between them, the way a mechanic looks at a broken valve. He wasn't appealing to her empathy. He was appealing to her fear of liability. He thrust the analyzer screen between them. The display showed a jagged, violent mountain range of yellow spikes. "Look at the spectral density," Penhaligon said, his voice flat, stripped of any apology. "That isn't a flat line. That is a 60 Hz mains hum riding a 3 kHz carrier wave. The room is drowning out the patient." The nurse blinked, the technical jargon hitting her like a physical object. She looked at the screen, then at the patient. The Admiral turned from the window, his attention snagged by the intrusion. The security detail stiffened, hands dropping to their belts. Penhaligon ignored the guns. He walked past the nurse, stepping into the red zone around the bed. He pointed the analyzer's probe at the bundle of cables behind the ventilator. The yellow spikes on the screen jumped higher, maxing out the scale. "NEC Article 517.13, Penhaligon announced, reciting the code like a Miranda warning. "All patient care areas must have a redundant ground path. The ground resistance must be less than 0.1 ohms. But you broke the bond." He pointed a shaking finger at the Admiral's black communications rack humming in the corner. "That device uses a switching power supply. It chops the voltage to encrypt the signal. It dumps the waste energy into the ground wire. But because you plugged it into the red circuit, That waste energy has nowhere to go but back into the patient. The Admiral stepped forward, his voice a low rumble of command. What are you doing to my equipment? I am removing the interference, Penhaligon said. He didn't wait for an order. He dropped to one knee. The security lead shouted, Stop! But the distance was too short. Penhaligon reached for the heavy black plug jammed into the emergency outlet. It was warm to the touch, vibrating with the heat of the encryption processor. He gripped the molded plastic and pulled. The connection severed with a sharp blue spark. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The low-frequency thrum that had permeated the room, a sound so constant that no one had realized it was there until it was gone, vanished. The cooling fans on the military rack spun down with a dying whine. The lights on the encryption array winked out. For a second, the only sound in the room was the heavy breathing of the security guard who had lunged halfway to the wall. Penhaligon stood up. He didn't look at the Admiral. He turned to the bedside monitor. The EEG trace was still a flat line, but the quality of the line had changed. It was no longer the rigid, ruler-straight edge of a clipped signal. It was soft, fuzzy, wandering slightly with the thermal drift of the room. The electrical pressure had been vented. The ground loop was broken. The patient was no longer part of the circuit. The noise floor is gone, Penhaligon muttered, his fingers flying over the membrane keys of the monitor. Now we find the signal. He accessed the service menu, a hidden layer of the interface that doctors rarely touched. The gain was set to auto, which meant the machine had been trying to listen to the encryption noise and had deafened itself in self-defense. Penhaligon switched it to manual. He dialed the sensitivity down, then slowly, carefully, began to bring it back up. He was recalibrating the ears of the machine, teaching it to ignore the silence and listen for the whisper. Watch the screen, he said. Don't watch the boy. Watch the geometry. The atmosphere in the VIP suite shifted instantly from mourning to hostility. The moment the encryption rack powered down, the Chief of Neurology lunged forward, his face a mask of professional outrage. To him, this wasn't a technical correction. It was a desecration. A maintenance worker had just cut the power to a grieving father's communications equipment and was now typing commands into a life support monitor. The security detail unholstered their tasers, the plastic clicking loudly in the sudden silence. The attending nurse reached for the wall phone to call a code gray, security assistance required. Penhaligon ignored them all. He had entered the technician's tunnel, a psychological state where the social threats of the room fade into background noise, leaving only the device and the problem. He wasn't being brave. He was simply prioritizing the variables. The angry doctor was a variable that could wait. The clipping error was a variable that was currently killing the patient. He focused entirely on the signal-to-noise ratio. In forensic telemetry, this is the holy grail. You are always trying to find the tiny, microvolt whisper of biology inside the roaring hurricane of the electromagnetic environment. Penhaligon's fingers moved across the membrane keys of the GE solar monitor, bypassing the user-friendly nurse view and diving deep into the biomed configuration menu. He located the filter submenu. The machine had been running wide open, accepting every frequency from 0 to 100 Hz. That was the mistake. The encryption noise had been sitting right in the middle of that bandwidth, masking everything else. Penhaligon selected the notch filter. This is a digital scalpel. It tells the processor to ignore a specific frequency, usually 60 Hz for power lines, but Penhaligon dialed it wider. He set it to reject everything above 40 Hz. Brainwaves are slow. They live in the deep, rhythmic basement of the frequency spectrum. Anything vibrating faster than 40 times a second wasn't a thought. It was interference. He hit apply. The screen flickered. The rigid, ruler-straight line that had defined the boy's death for 2 days vanished. In its place, the trace dropped to the true bottom of the graph and stayed there. For 10 seconds, the screen showed nothing but a flat, empty drift. This was the dead band. It is the most terrifying moment in any calibration. You have stripped away the noise, removed the artifact, and cleared the stage. If the patient is truly dead, this is where the truth is laid bare. The line wasn't perfectly straight anymore. It had the slight, organic wander of thermal resistance, but it was flat. There were no spikes, no rhythms, no life. The room held its breath. The Chief of Neurology let out a short, derisive huff of air, a sound that vindicated his diagnosis. The nurse crossed her arms, waiting for the security team to drag the intruder out. Penhaligon felt a bead of cold sweat roll down his spine inside the gray cardigan. If he was wrong, if the boy really was brain dead, he had just interrupted a military funeral to show the father a blank screen. He would be fired before he reached the elevator. He might be arrested. But Penhaligon trusted the copper. He pressed the impedance check button. On the screen, a diagram of the human head appeared, with glowing dots representing the electrode locations. One by one, the dots turned from yellow to green. Frontal lobe, green. Temporal, green. Occipital, green. The connection was perfect. The resistance was below 5 kiloohms. The sensors were touching the skin, and the path to the machine was clear. There was no loose wire. There was no faulty sensor. The machine was listening. "The leads are solid," Penhaligon whispered, more to the machine than the room. "The path is clear. Talk to me." The Admiral stepped past the doctor. He didn't look at the chief. He looked at the technician kneeling on the floor. The Admiral was a man who understood the difference between a comfortable lie and a hard tactical situation. He saw the green lights on the impedance map. He saw the sweat on Penhaligon's neck. He saw the absolute, terrifying focus in the man's hands. "Technician," the Admiral said, his voice low and dangerous. "Explain what I am looking at. Why is the line still flat?" Penhaligon didn't look up. He adjusted the gain one last time, cranking the sensitivity to a level that would normally be impossible in a noisy room. He was magnifying the signal 10,000 times. He was asking the machine to listen for the electrical equivalent of a pin drop. "I removed the static, sir," Penhaligon said, his finger hovering over the refresh key. "The machine was deafened by your radio. Now it's listening. If there is anything in there, if there is even a single neuron firing, we will see the geometry." He pressed the key. The screen refreshed, the grid sweeping from left to right, wiping away the history, searching the silence for a new pattern. The cursor moved across the void, leaving a trail of green phosphor behind it. Flat, flat, flat. Then the geometry changed. It started as a stutter. The green cursor, which had been tracing a sterile, infinite horizon for 48 hours, suddenly snagged. It wasn't a violent spike. It didn't look like the dramatic, high-amplitude jaggedness of a seizure. It was subtle, a slow, rolling deflection that lifted the line above the baseline and held it there for half a second before dropping back down. To a layman, it looked like a glitch. To a neurologist, it looked like a mistake. But to a signal auditor, it looked like a theta burst. The room remained frozen. The Chief of Neurology leaned in, his eyes narrowing, waiting for the line to flatten out again, waiting for the machine to correct itself and return to the comfortable consensus of death. But the line didn't flatten. It hesitated, then rose again. This time, the shape was different. It was jagged, asymmetrical, and chaotic. And that chaos was the proof. In the world of forensic telemetry, we distinguish between artifact and biology by looking at the geometry of the wave. Artifacts, signals caused by power lines, cell phones, or loose wires, are repetitive. They are cyclical. They repeat the same pattern over and over because they are driven by machines. They are predictable. But biology is stochastic. A human brain, even a damaged one, never repeats itself exactly. It is a wet, organic computer constantly firing in nonlinear patterns. The wave on the screen was messy. It wandered. It had no fixed frequency. It shifted from 4 Hz to 7 Hz and back again. It was the electrical signature of a deep, comatose struggle. The brainstem wasn't dead. It was fighting. It was pushing a weak, desperate voltage up through the cortex, trying to bridge the gap caused by the trauma. For 2 days, that signal had been screaming into the void, drowned out by the 60 Hz roar of the Admiral's encryption rack. The boy hadn't been silent. We had just been deaf. The Chief of Neurology let out a sound that was half gasp, half curse. He knew the criteria for brain death better than anyone in the room. The primary requirement is isoelectric silence, the total absence of electrical activity above 2 microvolts. The wave on the screen was hitting 15 microvolts. The diagnosis was instantly, mathematically invalidated. The certificate he had signed was now a piece of fiction. "He's cycling," the chief whispered, the authority draining out of his voice, replaced by the raw panic of a clinician who realizes he almost buried a living patient. "Get the pressure monitors back online. Check the pupils." The atmosphere in the VIP suite shattered. The somber, church-like reverence of the death vigil evaporated, replaced instantly by the violent, kinetic energy of a trauma bay. The narrative of letting go was violently overwritten by the narrative of damage control. Nurses who had been standing back with hands clasped in sympathy suddenly dove for the crash cart. The attending physician began shouting orders for mannitol and hypertonic saline. The Admiral, pushed back by the sudden swarm of white coats, looked at the screen, then at the technician. Penhaligon didn't join the scramble. He didn't check the pupils. He didn't look at the Admiral. His job was done. The clipping error had been resolved. The signal-to-noise ratio had been restored to a survivable level. He stood up, his knees cracking slightly in the hush of the corner, and began to coil the leads of his spectrum analyzer. He watched the monitor for one more second, observing the hidden geometry of survival. The line was ugly, erratic, and weak, but it was undeniably there. It was a testament to the resilience of the human machine, which had continued to function even when the experts had decided it was broken. The medical team was now frantically trying to reverse the comfort care protocols they had initiated. They were re-intubating, remedicating, fighting to save the life they had just agreed was lost. They were heroes again, working to save the Admiral's son. No one looked at the man in the gray cardigan. No one noticed as he snapped the plastic cover back onto his fluke meter. He was the mechanic who had unlocked the door so the doctors could walk through it. Penhaligon backed away from the bed, stepping into the shadows near the door. The flatline had been a lie, a masking error generated by the collision of rank and physics. The brain had been screaming the whole time. Penhaligon gripped the handle of his service cart. He didn't need to hear the thank you. He didn't need the validation. He just needed the math to be right. He opened the heavy door, slipping out of the pressurized chaos of the VIP suite and back into the silent, indifferent hallway of the hospital infrastructure. 72 hours after the plug was pulled, the patient, case file 709, was upgraded from clinical deceased to critical but stable. The swelling had receded. The brainstem, no longer deafened by the encryption noise, was driving the lungs with a steady, rhythmic cadence. The hospital public relations team called it a miraculous recovery, a testament to the relentless hope of the clinical staff. They drafted press releases celebrating the Chief of Neurology's intuition. But in the basement, the narrative was different. In the basement, we don't believe in miracles. We believe in root cause analysis. The Admiral was a man of systems. He did not accept miracle as a debriefing category. He demanded a forensic audit of the event. He wanted to know why his son was declared dead on Tuesday and alive on Wednesday. The hospital administration, terrified of a malpractice suit from a four-star officer, attempted to firewall the incident. They floated the theory of a faulty sensor or a software glitch in the GE monitor. They tried to blame the manufacturer, suggesting the algorithm had failed to detect the low-voltage activity. It was a classic liability drift. Push the blame away from the staff and onto the hardware. But Penhaligon had already filed his report. Incident report number 4099-B was not written in medical Latin. It was written in the cold, unassailable language of electrical engineering. Under cause of failure, Penhaligon didn't list diagnostic error. He wrote, failure of equipotential bonding due to unauthorized load. He attached the printout from the spectrum analyzer, showing the 60 Hz mains hum riding the 3 kHz encryption carrier wave. He detailed the violation of NEC Article 517.13. He noted that the red emergency circuit had been compromised by a non-medical device drawing 1,200 watts of dirty power. The report was a smoking gun made of math. It landed on the desk of the risk management director like a grenade. There was no way to spin it. The Admiral's own security team had created the interference, but the hospital staff had failed to recognize it. The Chief of Neurology had treated a noise artifact as a clinical truth. The authority gradient had prevented the nurses from questioning the setup. The fallout was handled with the quiet, brutal efficiency of a large institution protecting itself. There were no public apologies. There were no firings. The Chief of Neurology was quietly rotated off the trauma service for a sabbatical. The Admiral took his son and transferred him to Walter Reed the moment he was stable for transport. And Arthur Penhaligon? He received no medal. He was not invited to the press conference. He didn't even get a thank you from the family. Instead, 2 weeks later, a hospital-wide memo was circulated by facilities management. Subject: Updated protocols for patient care vicinity electrical safety. It stated, in bold text, that no personal or external electronic devices are to be connected to red emergency outlets under any circumstances. It was a dry, boring policy update that 90% of the staff deleted without reading. But to Penhaligon, that memo was a victory. It was a patch applied to the operating system of the hospital. He sat in his basement office, watching the remote telemetry feed from the ICU. The bed in 1204 was empty now, but he was monitoring a new admission in 1206. He watched the green line trace across the screen. He saw the thermal noise. He saw the heartbeat. He saw the truth of the voltage. This is the reality of modern medicine. We have built a system where we trust the screen more than the patient. We look at the data, not the body. We assume the machine is infallible, forgetting that the machine is just a voltmeter with a good marketing department. If the screen says you are dead, the institution agrees. If the screen says you are alive, the institution agrees. The human element, the intuition, the touch, the common sense, has been deprecated. Penhaligon adjusted his glasses and logged out of the system. He wasn't a hero. Heroes are for stories with happy endings. He was just a signal auditor. He had corrected a calibration error. He had cleaned the noise from the line. And in the high-stakes, low-margin world of technical medicine, that is the only justice that matters. The boy was alive not because of a prayer, but because a technician knew the difference between a brainwave and a ground loop. The Admiral's son survived because one person stopped looking at the rank and started looking at the resistance. In a system blinded by status and deafened by interference, the truth wasn't found in the diagnosis. It was found in the wiring. The flatline was a lie, but the physics never bluffed. If you want to see more forensic dissections of the failures hidden inside the system, subscribe to the case files. We analyze the data the doctors missed. End of log.